הניסים ועל הברכן ועל הגבורות ועל התשועות ועל הנפלאות, על הניסים ועל הברכן ועל הגבורות ועל התשועות ועל הנפלאות שעשית לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה, בזמן הזה שעשית לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה.
Welcome to Jewish Life, a program presented in cooperation with the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. I'm your host, Stewart Ain. Every week, we present programs of particular interest to the Jewish community. Today, my guest is Gershon Baskin. He's an Israeli peace activist, and he is in Jerusalem. And we welcome to the program. He's also a columnist. We get his column regularly. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
As we record this, the war between Israel and Hamas is continuing, but I wanted to see if we could take it beyond that. And you had written a column about what happens the day after. How does this get resolved? How do we have Israel and Hamas if it'll obviously still exist, but it won't be the same kind of organization it was. It won't pose a threat to Israel. But how do the Palestinians? What happens to them? So I thought you've got some ideas. What do you? First of all, let's take the Palestinian issue. Where do we go with that?
Okay, let's put the whole thing in a big picture so we can see it, because there are lots of moving parts that have to be done in coordination and in parallel in order for this to come out in a way that's better for all of us meaning all of us Israelis and all of us Palestinians. First thing to understand is that in my mind, there's no scenario in which Hamas continues to exist as the body governing Gaza after this war and threatening Israel. Israel has the military capability to dismantle Hamas's ability to govern and to exist as an organization threatening Israel from Gaza. It will require Israel to find and kill the leaders of Hamas, the political leaders and the military leaders, and to dismantle its infrastructure, find its stockpile of weapons, its ability to produce weapons, its ability to exist as an organization. But that's not the big challenge. The big challenge is challenging the idea of Hamas, the ideology of Hamas, which you cannot break apart with a military. Even the strongest military in the world cannot defeat an idea. Ideas are defeated by better ideas, and that's what we need to keep in focus as I paint out the picture that needs to exist after this. We're going to be facing a situation where more than 2 million people in Gaza are going to be devastated. They are devastated now, just as we on October 7th experienced the biggest trauma for Jews, for Israelis since the Holocaust. Without comparison, the Palestinians today are experiencing the biggest trauma since 1948, since their Nakba, the catastrophe. And these are traumas that don't go away. These are new chapters in our collective memories that we will remember forever. And we should not forget. We should not forget what they did to us, and they will not forget what we did to them. This is part of who we are as a people, and it's a defining moment in our existence as well. It means that we should never allow ourselves to be in a position where someone can do this to us again. And when I see us, I mean us Israelis and us Palestinians. I'm looking at it from both sides of the picture here. There will remain 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip who are our neighbors. And our challenge will be to find a way where we are all able to look forward and not only look backwards. So to challenge the idea of Hamas, which has been resistance to the existence of Israel, we have to hope that we will find ourselves at what I've been calling the Belfast moment. Now, take into account that what happened in Belfast was not a moment, it was a process. But they came to a moment where they stood up and said, after hundreds of years of killing each other, no more. We need to look forward. We need to find a way out of it. And the peace in Belfast is not a perfect peace. There's a long way to go before it's a perfect peace, but they're not killing each other anymore. And if we can get there, that'll be a major step forward. So Palestinians need to know that the occupation over them by Israel, the control over them by Israel, is going to come to an end. When President Biden speaks very boldly now about a two-state solution, which I thought was no longer viable. After years of having no negotiations and no prospects for a negotiated agreement between Israel and Palestine, it seemed that the two-state solution was no longer viable. All of a sudden, it's back on the map. It's back on the table. But we can no longer tolerate 30 years about talking about a two-state solution. It needs to be something real that Palestinians can grab onto as a sign of hope, which is not a 30-year Oslo peace process with an open end and no end game in sight. So the end game needs to be out front. When President Biden and other European leaders talk about a two-state solution, they need to put their money where their mouth is, and they need to recognize the state of Palestine. There are 138 countries in the world that recognize the state of Palestine. The state of Palestine is a non-member state of the United Nations. That needs to change. The Palestinian people need to know that they will have independence, that they will have dignity, that they will have sovereignty, even with possible limitations on that sovereignty. But the peace process now needs to be real. So the United States needs to take the lead and recognize Palestine. Palestine has to be granted membership in the United Nations. We need to have some kind of temporary arrangement in Gaza that will enable Israel to withdraw to the international border, because the longer that Israel stays in Gaza, the more we will face insurgency in Gaza. What happened to Israel in 1982 when it invaded southern Lebanon and pushed the PLO out, the villagers, the Shiite villagers in the south of Lebanon, initially threw rice and candies at the Israeli soldiers, and 3 or 4 months later were planting roadside bombs against them. No one will agree to be occupied. This has to be one of the lessons of the horrific things that happened to us on October 7th, is that we cannot occupy another people for 56 years and expect to have peace. We cannot lock 2 million people into a territory like Gaza with 80% poverty and expect there to be quiet. So there needs to be a temporary administration. While the Palestinians are engaging in deep reform, they need to get rid of their corruption. They need to change their system of government. They need to no longer have an 18-year president in a 4-year term. They need to have democratic elections. We can fence in those elections, or they can fence in those elections, to pass within their law that parties that support an armed struggle cannot run for elections. That's what they need to do. The international community needs to assist them in doing it. They need to elect a responsible government that's willing to accept the principle, along with us, that everyone living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea has the same right to the same rights. That's another expression of mutual recognition that we're all here. 7 million Israeli Jews, 7 million Palestinian Arabs living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea are here to stay, and we all have the right to be here. You want to ask me a question, so I'll stop.
Well, but it's going to be one people. That is a one government. There's not going to be a Gaza government, because
no. The Palestinian
Hamas kicked out
territories
the PA. Right. That's not going to happen. It's going
No,
to be
the Palestinian government needs to be over the West Bank, Gaza, and eventually they will have their capital in East Jerusalem as well.
Yes.
This
yes.
has to be happen.
And Abbas, we have to look beyond him.
My Palestinian friends say, with all due respect to Abbas, he can be president of Palestine for life. No one will touch him. No one will touch his money or his son's money. He will have ceremonial responsibilities, but they need to have democracy. One thing that all Palestinians agree on, probably the only thing that all Palestinians agree on, is that they want elections. And when in 2021 they were scheduled to have elections, their system is like the American system. You have to register to vote. Unlike Israel, where if you're in the population registry, you have the right to vote. In Palestine, more than 85% of the people in the West Bank and Gaza registered to vote, and 36 political parties registered to participate in those elections. It was a festival of democracy that cut short because the United States, Israel, and Abbas didn't want to hold those elections. But they need to hold elections. Next, we need to have an international rebuilding, fixing Gaza and building the Palestinian economy. It needs to be led by the United States.
Rebuilding
a Marshall Plan.
Yes.
It needs to be led by the U.S., but I think it should be done by the U.S. and China together in the lead. Not only does no one in the world know how to build infrastructure faster, more effectively, and more efficiently and affordably than the Chinese, But that would also help the whole global economy. The United States and China don't have to compete over rebuilding of Gaza and lifting the Palestinian economy. It would help us all. Because no one's going to agree to rebuild Gaza if we know it's only going to be bombed again. When we engage in a renewed peace process, we need to learn the lessons from the past. For instance, if the Israelis and the Palestinians don't engage in educational reform, in making a commitment to educate the next generation to live in peace, peace will never happen. The Palestinian curriculum and textbooks are much worse than the Israelis, but we have a lot of work to do in the Israeli textbooks as well. We in Israel need to study Arabic from kindergarten. The Palestinians need to study Hebrew from kindergarten. There is no reason why we shouldn't speak each other's languages. And what we teach our children is a reflection of our values. If we value our lives and we want to sanctify lives, we have to understand that we're all going to live here and we're going to be neighbors. And peace is not going to be built by walls and fences. We might need them initially, but what we need to do is build bridges between these communities who have so much hatred and fear of each other today more than ever before.
Yeah, and it wasn't always that way. I remember going to Israel and the Palestinians there was conversation. You used to go there. People used to go to each other's homes. I mean, it's totally. I was ready to go. I was supposed to go with the Israeli government. I guess the military was going to take me into Gaza. I was all set to go, and they called the day before and said we can't go. Situation is too hot. That's it. And that was really when it remember that Israel left Israel. Israel left in 2005, left Gaza.
We left Gaza, but we didn't really leave because we continued to control it. Together with Egypt, we put a blockade on Gaza. We didn't allow people to travel. We didn't let goods in and out freely. There was no real economic development there. There was no chance for, before the war, there were 7 working universities and colleges in Gaza that most young people attended, but graduates of those universities and colleges had no future. There was no work. There were no jobs for them. And this is the tragedy of Gaza. And this is why we can't expect to lock 2 million people up into this kind of small territory with no economy and expect them to live in quiet.
Right before the attack on October 7th of 2023, Israel opened up the gates to more Palestinians to come.
There were 17,000 Palestinians were working in Israel. That doesn't supply an answer to a population of 2.3 million. That doesn't buy it. If people
they
thought
were gradually opening it. So,
but after 17 years of blockade, they let 17,000 workers into Israel. That doesn't make it. Gaza before 2005 was exporting flowers and fruits and vegetables to Europe. 1/12 of Israel's fresh produce came from Gaza. There used to be an open economy. At the time that Gaza was shut, there were 1 million pieces of textile being sewn in Gaza for Israeli factories that were being exported to Europe. All that ended when Israel left Gaza in 2005, because we not only left, we closed the gate and we locked it and we threw away the key. And Gaza was not open to the world. It was closed. And then when Hamas brutally took over from the Palestinian Authority in 2007 and killed many of the Fatah leaders there, Gaza was permanently and shut off by the Egyptians and by the Israelis together. And no one would agree to live under those circumstances.
But the argument is also that Israelis left working factories or what they had farms and whatnot, and they left all the equipment. They left everything there, and they said, look, the Palestinians can come in, they can continue to flourish and whatnot, and everything was destroyed overnight. They destroyed everything.
No, that's not true.
That's not true?
That's not true. The truth is that when the Palestinians took over the farms that were in the Gush Katif area, there were 4,000 dunam, that's 4,000 square meters of hothouses were left there that were not damaged. They were taken over by a Palestinian company that ran it with the same workers who worked there when they were Jewish owned. And they were growing fruits, they were growing vegetables for the Haredi community. They were glatt kosher, no insects. They were inspected. And they were brought to the border 2 seasons, and the border was closed. They couldn't get their produce to the markets. And after 2 growing seasons, the management company that was running it went bankrupt. That's the story. We closed the border. We didn't give them a chance of developing an economy after Israel left. Now, Israel left Gaza, not as part of a political plan, but Ariel Sharon, the one who left Gaza, did it in order to say to the world, we left Gaza, look how they failed. Stop putting pressure on us in the West Bank. Those were Sharon's plans. He didn't do it as a negotiated agreement that empowered Mahmoud Abbas, who had resigned from the Palestinian Authority because he opposed the militarization of the Intifada. He came back after Arafat died. He was elected president on a ticket of peace and negotiations, and Sharon refused to negotiate with him. Israel left unilaterally. And guess who won the narrative of kicking Israel out of Gaza? Hamas did. Because Hamas went to the public and said, we, with our armed struggle, fought against the Israelis, and they running out of Gaza with their tails between their legs. That's the narrative that every Palestinian and most of the Arab world believes, that Israel only understands the language of force and violence and only responds diplomatically when force is used against them. When there were negotiations, we never got to an end game. The story is that Israel offered them everything and they said no. Well, they said no because the offers weren't yet right for them. And when Olmert made progress with Abbas, he never got to finish because he was indicted and was forced to leave. And Tzipi Livni and Condoleezza Rice told Mahmoud Abbas to wait for Tzipi Livni to become prime minister. And guess what? She never did. Netanyahu came in, and Netanyahu's goal was to show the world that we have no partners and there's no one to negotiate with. So he kept Hamas in power. He had many opportunities to destroy Hamas. He didn't want to. He got them funded by the Qataris. He kept them in power, and he kept Mahmoud Abbas as an illegitimate leader in the West Bank in power so that Israel can say, we have no one to negotiate with, because Netanyahu's primary objective was to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state next to Israel. And he made the Palestinian question disappeared. He got Trump to go along with him. We had the Abraham Accords that showed that we could make peace with some Arab countries without dealing with the Palestinians. And guess what? On October 7th, it blew up in our face.
Yeah, and there are reports, and nobody's disputing it, that Israel even had all the plans of what was going to be done, how they planned it out.
Apparently, but our arrogance didn't allow us to believe that any of it could be real. We thought we spent $1 billion building a fence and walls along the Gaza Strip, and that would protect us, while the army was sent into the West Bank to defend settlers against Palestinians, because the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, had become over 2 decades the Israeli occupation police force, protecting settlers against Palestinians who were fighting for their rights for freedom and dignity. And it's true that they continue to use terrorism against Israelis, but that struggle will not end until there is a people living next door to us who have a sense of dignity, a sense of independence and freedom.
Netanyahu is the prime minister now. What do you think is going to, that trial of his is held up, but it's going to
the trial renewed actually today or yesterday. But
is that right?
He will be brought down. He will be brought down not because of the trial. He will be brought down because of his failures, which most of the people will point to October 7th. In my mind, his failures are much bigger and much longer than October 7th. But his day of reckoning is coming as he's trying to deflect any responsibility for what happened on October 7th, putting the responsibility on the intelligence, on the army, on anyone but himself. But he will be forced to pay the price for his failures. The Israeli public no longer supports Netanyahu. His days are going to end in the not too distant future.
And do you see him being imprisoned?
I don't know.
Because of this trial?
I would be happy to see him just step down and disappear from public life. If he is found guilty and serves time in prison, that's irrelevant to me. Right now, the thing that's most important is for us to get rid of him from our political lives.
Okay, so we had a right-wing government before this whole started. That government is gone?
Not yet. They're still in power and still doing damage every day.
Yeah,
they will be gone. I have no idea who will replace them. Quite frankly, between you and me, I don't see anyone in the entire Israeli political arena that inspires me. We will probably find people who will replace Netanyahu. Maybe it'll be Gantz. Maybe it'll be other people like that. They're not particularly inspiring leaders. Maybe we need a period of leaders like them to stabilize the situation before the next generation of leaders stand up and be noticed. Maybe they'll come from the protest movement that existed for 40 weeks before the war. Maybe they'll be unidentified people who we don't know who they are now. But a new generation of leaders in Israel and in Palestine will be shown. They will stand up and we will notice them. And if they are responsible people who are able to look forward and not only backwards, they will rise to positions of leadership and take us out of this mess that we are in.
You wrote a column about Marwan Barghouti. Were you serious? I mean, how many life terms is he serving
Marwan
now?
Barghouti is serving 5 consecutive life sentences plus 40 years. Marwan Barghouti was the elected leader of the Palestinian parliament before he was arrested. He was also the leader of the Second Intifada. He is someone who is the most popular Palestinian leader. He comes out #1 in every single Palestinian poll over the last 2 decades, regardless of who he's against.
Incredible, isn't it?
It is important to know that he was not convicted of killing anyone himself. He was found guilty for responsibility for killing of 5 Israelis, and that's why he got the 5 consecutive life sentences. He refused to recognize the legitimacy of the court, and he provided no defense. At the end of the trial, the judge allowed him to make a statement. He read out what was an indictment against the state of Israel and the occupation. He has never agreed to recognize the legitimacy of his sentencing, and most of the Palestinian people see him as a leader. I know Marwan. I spent many, many hours with him in the years before he was elected. I have communicated with him through his lawyer over these years. I know that he still supports the 2-state solution. I think that the Israeli security should be engaging him in dialogue now. It would not be the first time that longtime prisoners convicted of terrorism or murder have emerged on the global scene as leaders. I remind people that it wasn't de Klerk that engaged with Mandela that eventually led to his freedom. It was Botha, the hard-line regime of apartheid that started talking to Mandela when he was in prison, convicted as a terrorist, a leader of the ANC, and he emerged several years later as the democratically elected president of South Africa. Now, I'm not saying that Marwan Barghouti is Nelson Mandela. I don't believe that Marwan Barghouti has the moral code and compass that Nelson Mandela had, unfortunately. But Marwan is a leader, and he should be engaged, and people should be trying to find out if he is the leader who can lead Palestine to freedom and liberation and to make peace with Israel, to leave the arms struggle behind, and to recognize that the Jewish people also have a right to live in the land of Israel.
Have you heard from him since your column?
No, because since the war, even his lawyer is having difficulty meeting with him. I'm not sure that even family visits have been allowed. His wife was meeting with him every week, and some of his children as well. His lawyer generally meets with him every other week, but I think that since the beginning of the war, he hasn't. Now, it was published in Arabic in an Arabic newspaper, and I hope that they were able to smuggle in the Arabic newspaper into the prison, or maybe one of the prison guards brought it to him in the Arabic version. I did send it to his lawyer for him to give to Marwan the next time he sees him.
Interesting. The New York Times had a story about you and Ghazi Hamad. Now, Ghazi has been seen on American television as a spokesperson. You recognize him right away. What happened there? It's like overnight. He doesn't want to talk to you, doesn't know you anymore. And
I said I don't want to talk to him anymore, actually. Ghazi Hamad is someone that I know for 17 years. We have negotiated for 17
2006,
years. We
absolutely.
have spoken more than 1,000 times. We have met face-to-face 4 times. He left Gaza before the war began. I didn't know that he wasn't in Gaza when the war began. He's in Beirut, and he was sent to Beirut to be the spokesperson of the war. And from the things that he's been saying, he's not the same person that I knew all these years, because he and I had conversations about peace. We had negotiations over long-term ceasefires. We together saved the life of Gilad Shalit. It was Ghazi Hamad was responsible for making sure that there was a direct line to the people holding Gilad Shalit that enabled him to eventually be released through a negotiated agreement. It was a bad agreement. It was a difficult agreement. 1,027 Palestinians were released in exchange for Gilad Shalit. Nonetheless, That wouldn't have happened without Ghazi Hamid. But that person who's sitting in Beirut today, being the spokesperson of this war, justifying the terrorism of October 7th and saying they would do it over and over and over again, and saying that Israel had to be annihilated, is not the same person that I knew. And I told him that he was no longer worthy of even talking to me. And we cut off relations. But you know what? If I thought that talking to him could help save the lives of hostages, I would continue talking to him. But I know he's no longer sitting in Beirut within the decision-making circle. He doesn't have direct access to the decision makers in the tunnels and bunkers underneath the Gaza Strip. And therefore, talking to him is futile. And I won't disrespect my own honor by talking to him.
But you believe he was sent out deliberately to be the spokesperson?
I believe he was, which means that he knew that what was planned on October 7th. He probably didn't understand and know the dimensions of what happened. I don't think any of the Palestinians did, because no one could have expected them to breach Israel's border as easily as they did and allow more than 3,000 terrorists to cross into Israel that day. So I think Hamas was surprised about how easy it was to cross into Israel. And they honestly believed in the first days after October 7th that they were on the road to liberating Palestine, as they called it. There's a very famous Palestinian from Gaza who lives in London, who's an influencer on YouTube and Instagram, and he put out a spontaneous YouTube a couple of days after the war. His name is Abu Julia. That's the name he goes. He said because he likes Julia Roberts, he took the name Abu Julia. That's what I heard anyway. Anyway, Abu Julia put out this very spontaneous YouTube in which he said, "Don't give me 2 days of happiness and celebrating and a life of misery." And I think what we saw in the first days when Palestinians were celebrating the breach of the border into Israel and the horrific acts of terrorism that were committed there, they were celebrating way too early, and they are now paying a horrible price and will suffer miserably for years to come because of the crimes that they committed on October 7th.
Are you surprised about the brutality and what was done? It's so horrific. It's hard to believe that another human being could do that.
That's right. Yeah, I was surprised by the brutality and the horrific things that have done, and I don't think all the stories have gotten out yet. God knows what's happening to the 14 or 15 young women who are still in Gaza who weren't released yet in the hostage deal. The intelligence reports and the assessments are that they have been brutally gang raped and sexually abused, and that's why Hamas has not released them. They may end up dead because of that as well. And it's just horrific that the 370 people who were butchered at the music festival at Ra'im and the rapes that took place there, really inhuman. When I said, for years I've been negotiating with Hamas on a possibility of a long-term ceasefire. The only reason why I negotiated with them is because they were there to stay, because Netanyahu had decided that they would be there to stay. And therefore I thought, if they're there ruling Gaza, we need to find a way to have a modus vivendi where we can live next door to them without having rockets rain down on us all the time. But after October 7th, I wrote very clearly in my letter to Ghazi Hamid and in public, I said, they lost their right to exist. They simply can no longer exist as a governing body responsible for millions of people as our neighbors. They lost that right when they crossed that line between humanity and what's on the other side.
Yeah, and how they expected. I don't understand what they thought was day 2 after they did this. What did they expect to happen? Israel
well, they thought that they were on the road to liberating Palestine. There are some, just as there are some Messianic Jews who believe that redemption is around the corner and settling the land of Israel will bring the Messiah. There are Palestinians there are at least 2 Palestinian imams in the West Bank who have predicted that Israel will fall apart. Israel will cease to exist. One of them says in 2023, and there are a lot of people who believe them, even not very religious Islamists who believe him. And the other sheikh says it will happen, but in 2030. So there are people who believe these prophecies, and they give evidence from the Quran, from the holy scriptures to justify what they claim, just as there are crazy fanatic Jews who do the same thing with Jewish text and predict all kinds of things about what they believe will happen or need to happen, which includes expelling Palestinians from their land, or people who are writing now saying that we have to call for cause of the 2 million people living in Gaza to leave Gaza. We need to settle that land as part of the land of Israel. There are lots of crazies around here who will ignite the entire Middle East and take thousands of people along with them.
Gershon Baskin, live from Jerusalem. Thanks so much. Good to see you.
I
this
should
hour.
point out,
Yes.
you said this goes out to listeners in Long Island.
Yes.
I'm a Long Islander. I grew up in Long Island. My roots are in Belmore and in Smithtown. That's
Very
where I
good.
grew up.
Great. Well, thank you again, Gershon
Thank
Baskin.
you.
My name is Stewart Ain. Until next week, have a good one.